In the wreckage of war, truth is the first casualty, and sometimes the last to be buried. Across forgotten bunkers, sealed vaults, and classified transcripts, fragments of a different war emerge, one fought in silence, behind locked steel doors and under the noise of victory parades. It was a conflict of vanished ships, erased files, and orders written in ink that never reached daylight. Decades later, as declassified pages resurface and coded entries are decrypted, the shadows of 1945 begin to whisper again. These are not myths or legends. They are what was meant never to be found. Chapter 1. The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic Sea. On the night of January 30th, 1945, the port of Gotenhafen, today known as Gdynia, Poland, was a maelstrom of panic and desperation. Tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers crowded the docks under the yellow glare of burning oil, clutching whatever they could carry. Soviet artillery thundered from the east, and the Baltic wind howled through the ruins. Amid the chaos, a grey-painted vessel slipped from the harbour under blackout orders. Her name was SS Wotan, officially a cargo transport assigned to Mobor. Operation Hannibal, the mass evacuation of German personnel from East Prussia. Unofficially, she carried something that would never appear in any manifest. The Wotan was registered under the German Kriegsmarine Supply Division, but the officers aboard did not wear naval insignia. They were civilians, engineers and administrators from the Ahnenerbe, the SS's Research and Heritage Institute. Among the crew, whispers spoke of sealed containers stenciled with the eagle and swastika, labeled Nur für Reichsbehörde Sondergut, meaning for Reich authority only, special cargo. The containers were loaded under the direct supervision of Chancy Sturmbannführer Karl Reiner. Premier Kalm, a man whose name appears only once in surviving SS records, his unit, Sonderkommando Arkona, was believed to have been dismantled in late 1944. Yet witnesses claimed Reiner was aboard that night, overseeing every crate as it was hoisted into the cargo hold. By morning, the Wotan had joined a small convoy moving west under escort from 2 torpedo boats and the hospital ship Wilhelm Gustloff. Radio silence was absolute. Ice sheets fractured under the hull as the convoy pushed into the freezing Baltic. But only 3 hours after departure, the Wotan broke formation, veering north toward Bornholm Island under orders no one recalled giving. Its escort did not follow. Radar contact was lost at 02:17. Officially, the ship was presumed sunk by a Soviet submarine. No wreckage was ever found. In 1953, divers from the Soviet Navy's 7th Special Salvage Division reported discovering metallic debris near the Bornholm Deep, a restricted trench more than 100 meters below the surface. Fragments recovered included reinforced turbine casings alloyed with titanium and what Soviet reports described as a mercuric coolant assembly. The documents were marked SOV, Sekretna, top secret, and filed under Operation Helios. Decades later, in 1989, fragments of those same reports surfaced in a declassified KGB archive in Riga, revealing one phrase scrawled in pencil: Nicht Antrieb, sondern Reaktor. Not propulsion, but reactor. Western intelligence had already been aware of something unusual. In 1946, a British monitoring post at RAF Saxe Vord intercepted encoded transmissions between Soviet Baltic Command and Moscow, referring to an object of German origin located off Bornholm. The British report, later catalogued as File K217, was classified under NATO secrecy clause Omega 9 Aus. Only a handful of analysts saw the contents. Among them was a young naval intelligence officer, Commander Hugh W. Atwell, who wrote in a marginal note, "If true, this confirms rumors of the Ahnenerbe's energy research, non-standard materials, potential reactor prototypes." For decades, no one spoke of the Wotan again. The Baltic was too deep, too hostile, and the Cold War too full of competing secrets. Yet, in 1972, a Swedish fishing vessel recorded magnetic anomalies near the same coordinates cited in the Soviet log. The readings fluctuated between 0.7 and 1.3 Tesla, far above background levels for the region. Maritime authorities dismissed the event as sonar interference. But the following year, a NATO hydrographic mission, Survey Delta 34 quietly confirmed identical anomalies. The final paragraph of their internal memorandum read, "Recommends suppression of public release. Object may relate to unacknowledged wartime technology." The deeper story began to surface only after the fall of the Soviet Union. In 1993, a retired Russian naval engineer named Leonid Borodin gave an interview to a Polish journalist in Gdansk. Borodin claimed he had served aboard the salvage vessel Kurski 17 during the 1953 recovery attempt. He described descending into a metallic structure buried in sediment, surrounded by twisted conduits, like veins. Inside, he said, were sealed glass tubes filled with silvery liquid that vibrated when touched by light. Within weeks of the interview's publication, Borodin disappeared. His apartment was found undisturbed, his passport on the kitchen table. The Polish newspaper that published the story received an anonymous telegram reading, "Only. Archive K217 should remain closed." If the story had ended there, it would have faded into myth. But in 2006, a Danish sonar expedition mapping the Bornholm Trench captured a high-resolution image of what appeared to be a 60-meter object, partially buried, with a perfect circular depression at its center. Analysis indicated structural alloys inconsistent with post-war manufacturing. The Danish Maritime Authority refused to release the full data, citing national security cooperation agreements. When pressed, a spokesman simply replied, "Some wrecks are better left undisturbed." Historians have long debated what the Wotan might have carried. Some believe it transported experimental turbine engines from Peenemünde or shipborne jet propulsion units from Kiel. Others argue it was part of the Man Project Glock, a rumored, uninherb device involving liquid mercury and high-voltage fields. While evidence for that remains speculative, recovered documents from Oberkommando der Marine, OKM, archives in Flensburg, reference energy modules for transport to safe harbor, Baltic sector, dated January 27, 1945, 3 days before the Wotan vanished. What remains undeniable is the extent of Allied cooperation in concealing the aftermath. Declassified minutes from a 1947 meeting of the Allied Control Council reveal that both US and Soviet representatives agreed to suspend discussion on all German research materials recovered from the Baltic region. The agreement, drafted by Colonel Edwin L. Stokes of the US Army Technical Mission and signed by Soviet General Ivan Serov, effectively erased the Wotan from official post-war history. The final trace appeared in 1961, when an internal memo from the US Navy's Office of Naval Research referenced continued Bornholm activity under project number ONR 5113A, funded through a NATO subgrant. The project's stated aim was analysis of anomalous marine magnetic fields. 2 years later, all records of 5113A were purged during a database migration. Only one microfilm copy survived, found decades later in a misfiled archive box labeled Ocean Currents, Northern Theatre. It contained 3 photographs, grainy, underwater shots of a corroded hull segment stamped with faded German script. Eigentum der Ahnenerbe. Property of the Ahnenerbe. In 2014, a private research team from Rostock University attempted an independent dive at the alleged wreck site. Their submersible's camera feed went dead at a depth of 96 meters. The last recorded frame showed a metallic structure with hexagonal indentations, partially covered by sediment. Contact with the dive team was lost for 3 hours. When they resurfaced, the crew refused interviews, and the expedition's leader, Dr. Matthias Kuhl, withdrew all public funding requests. Weeks later, the team's data drives were confiscated by the German Federal Maritime Agency under security review. Today, the Wotan remains a ghost ship in every sense. No confirmed wreck, no official manifest, no surviving crew. But the convergence of naval records, Allied archives, and modern sonar evidence suggests it existed. What it carried, however, may never be revealed. In the language of Cold War secrecy, both East and West had reasons to keep such a discovery silent. Whether it was a lost prototype reactor, a weapons experiment, or something stranger, one fact endures: the Wotan sailed under orders written in a language of denial. Somewhere beneath the icy silence of the Baltic, In a trench that sonar rarely touches lies a relic of a war that refused to end. And if the readings are accurate, if that magnetic hum still emanates from below, it means that after 80 years, something aboard the Wotan may still be active. Chapter 2: Operation Silver Ash, the Forgotten Airfield. In the last months of the war, while Allied bombers reduced German cities to ash and retreating divisions burned their own depots, something else was taking shape high in the Tyrolean Alps. Official Wehrmacht documents list a small airfield near Imst, Austria, designated Am Flugplatz 47 used primarily for weather observation and courier flights. Yet photographs taken by US reconnaissance in May 1945 showed reinforced concrete hangars carved directly into the mountainside and exhaust ports venting steam into the alpine air. The images were filed under AF Reconnaissance File, Throw 1, 26. Later stamped Confidential, Eyes Only. No Luftwaffe records mention 47B. The airfield does not appear on any official charts, nor do the post-war Austrian civil aviation authorities acknowledge its construction. But testimonies collected by Allied intelligence in June 1945 hint at a darker purpose. A captured German engineer, Oberbaurat Hans Linde, OWA, claimed he oversaw the installation of experimental propulsion facilities in tunnels near IMST. His statements were fragmentary, but one line from his interrogation report. TDS file, Shat 9211. Salzburg Depot stands out. They wanted engines that could fly without fuel, using the Earth's own pull. Locals remembered strange sights in the final weeks before surrender. Shepherds in the surrounding valleys spoke of silent aircraft rising at dusk, leaving behind no smoke, no noise, only a faint bluish shimmer that made the mountain peaks flicker like glass. At the time, such accounts were dismissed as hysteria or folklore, yet the consistency of these recollections, across villages separated by miles, drew the attention of the Allied Technical Intelligence Unit, ATIU. In July 1945, the ATIU dispatched a small team under Captain Robert H. Leland to locate 47B. Their field report, unearthed decades later in the US National Archives, tells a story of discoveries swiftly buried. Leland's team reached Imst on July 19th. They were guided by Austrian civilians who directed them toward a narrow mountain road leading to a high plateau called Silberhöhe, Silver Height. The area was littered with burned-out vehicles and shell casings. Halfway up the ascent, the Americans encountered a set of blast doors sealed with thermite. They spent 2 days cutting through the steel. Behind it lay a tunnel descending into the mountain. Inside were shattered crates, collapsed fuel drums, and walls scorched black. The air smelled of ozone and rust. Near the tunnel's end stood a single intact hangar, 40 meters long, with power lines running into a buried generator room. Within, the team found remains of 2 partially dismantled airframes, each roughly 10 meters across, circular rather than winged, with engine housings that appeared to rotate along their axis. Technical sketches recovered nearby bore the insignia Messerschmitt Bulkow Project Bureau, and a handwritten note dated February 1945 read simply, Versuchsgerät 23, Flugversuch ausgesetzt. Test device 23, flight trial suspended. Leland's men photographed everything. The negatives, labeled ATU Film Reel 47B, were sent to the Allied Control Commission in Frankfurt, but within weeks, they vanished from inventory. A short memo in the Commission's correspondence log recorded their transfer to a British liaison office in Vienna, pending joint evaluation. No further trace exists. The official report, however, survived, classified for over 50 years. Its final page includes one chilling observation. No bodies, no fuel residue, no signs of conventional combustion. Generator levels indicate power was drawn less than 2 weeks ago. What happened next was quietly erased from Allied records. The site was sealed and placed under control of the US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, who declared it a hazardous ordnance zone. Austrian authorities were denied entry. Even the British were reportedly excluded from subsequent evaluations. Years later, when NATO began conducting seismic studies of the region in 1958, engineers detected hollow cavities beneath the Silberhöhe Plateau, extending several hundred meters deeper than the original tunnel system. Instruments registered traces of tungsten shielding and anomalous radiation levels, far above normal geological background. When researchers requested follow-up access, the request was denied under I-shaped Directive Blue Phoenix, citing post-Valkyrie propulsion systems, restricted matter. The name silver ash first appears in correspondence between Major Harold Ingram, RF Intelligence, and Dr. Karl-Heinz Rupp, a German aeronautical scientist detained under Operation Surgeon, the British equivalent of the US Paperclip Initiative. Rupp admitted that the Tyrol site was part of a late-war project intended to build a high-altitude, self-sustaining reconnaissance aircraft using hybrid electrogravitic turbines technology so far outside wartime engineering that even Luftwaffe Command considered it theoretical. He also noted that the project's sponsor, Reichsforschungsrat Gruppe RWO, was dissolved weeks before war's end, its archives destroyed by SS Command. The most disturbing revelation came from an Allied interrogation of Rupp in 1946. The transcript, found decades later in a dusty folder at Kew Archives, records this exchange. Ingram: "Were these aircraft ever flown?" Rupp: "Once, not by us." Ingram: "Who then?" Rupp: "They came from Prague, from Kamler's staff. We were told to prepare the runway and leave. At dawn, something rose that wasn't ours." Ingram: "You mean German?" Rupp: "No, that's what frightened us." When asked to elaborate, Rupp refused, claiming oaths still bound him. He died of heart failure 2 months later in a detention camp near Oldenburg. In 1963, a US Air Force intelligence unit under Project Moondust, tasked with recovering unidentified aerospace materials, briefly referenced the Tyrol tunnels in a status report. Possible residual technology buried at Silberhöhe coordinates 4715N, 10-44E, radiation hazard confirmed, NATO cooperation ongoing. Once again, no follow-up was documented. Today, the supposed site of Flugplatz 47B lies within a restricted alpine zone managed by the Austrian military. Satellite imagery reveals what appear to be ventilation shafts embedded in rock, still maintained though no installations are registered there. Hikers report hearing low-frequency vibrations near the base of the cliffs at night, subsonic rumbles lasting several minutes. When approached, Austrian authorities dismissed the phenomenon as seismic instability. Yet, according to recently declassified shape documentation, a NATO technical inspection conducted in 1981 found residual power lines running beneath the plateau, feeding into a defunct transformer labeled USF DO-D 1949 property transfer. The inspection concluded that underground installations of non-Austrian origin remain sealed by agreement. In other words, whatever was buried under the Tyrolean rock after 1945 was never truly dismantled, merely inherited. Historians who've studied the surviving fragments agree on one point. Something was tested at Silberhöhe, whether it was an aircraft, an experimental propulsion system, or merely a symbol of the Reich's desperate final innovations, no one can prove. But when a US reconnaissance satellite, KH-9 Hexagon, captured a heat anomaly in the area during 1973, decades after the site was supposedly inert, it reignited old questions. Internal CIA memoranda debated whether the readings could be due to geothermal vents. One analyst wrote, "Too regular, too controlled, suggestive of intermittent machinery still operating below surface." The Tyrol remains silent. No official expedition has revisited the plateau in over 40 years. Locals still speak of strange lights reflecting off the peaks during winter storms, white flashes that appear without thunder, fading like breath on glass. And though the name Operation Silver Ash was never officially acknowledged, it continues to appear in intelligence indices, cross-referenced with post-war experimental flight programs. In the margins of a recently uncovered US Air Materiel Command document dated 1948, one typed note remains unredacted. Recovered components from Tyrol stored under Section R12, Right Field. Recommend indefinite classification. Origin unresolved. Whatever rose into those alpine skies in the dying hours of the Reich was no ordinary machine. The evidence buried at Flugplatz 47B suggests that at least once, before the surrender, something man-made took flight, using principles we still do not fully understand. And when it vanished into the clouds above Imst, it took with it a piece of history the world was never meant to see. Chapter 3. the Nuremberg file that never opened. In October 1946, as the final verdicts were handed down at the Nuremberg trials, clerks in the Allied Evidence Depot catalogued one last shipment of documents recovered from Eastern Germany. Among them sat a single crate marked Prosecutor's Annex 13D, Siemens AG, Smolensk Field Reports. The box was sealed in wax, stamped with the emblem of the US Army Office of Strategic Services, and logged into inventory under the care of Captain Leonard F. Hauser. Within days, 13D vanished. No record of its transfer, inspection, or destruction exists. For decades, it was nothing but a rumor whispered among archivists, an extra file connected to experiments no one could officially admit had happened. The story of 13D begins 2 years earlier. In 1944, near the occupied city of Smolensk, Soviet forces had retaken much of the region, but the surrounding forests were a labyrinth of abandoned German research outposts, many under the direction of Sonderabteilung Ziegel. A small SS technical unit specializing in psychological warfare. Their stated mission was communications and acoustic deception. But Soviet reports described something else entirely. Installations filled with stroboscopic lamps, lens arrays, and chemical generators. The materials were unlike standard military issue. A local Red Army intelligence report dated August 23, 1944, mentions optical suppression devices intended for disorientation of enemy infantry. That phrase appears again, in English, typed inside a British War Office memorandum from March 1945, citing Project Regenlicht, German for light of the rain. The phrase appears cryptic until connected to Siemens's wartime research division. Archival fragments from 1943 reveal Siemens engineers collaborating with SS medical officers under the Ahnenerbe Institute for Applied Biology, conducting studies on neurological responses to synchronized photonic patterns. The surviving notes, just a handful of carbon copies, describe experiments using stroboscopic bursts between 15 and 25 Hz projected against enemy positions. Witness accounts claim the flashes induced vertigo, disorientation, and temporary paralysis. No official battle reports confirm its use, but an OSS field cable from Warsaw, April 1945, mentions an incident of enemy collapse without visible wounds, witnessed by advancing Polish units. Coordinates given in that cable trace back to a small village southwest of Smolensk, near a destroyed munitions depot. When Allied investigators entered Germany after the surrender, they found Siemens engineers among the prisoners. One of them, Dr. Otto Falken, a physicist attached to the SS research section E. Sonderfeld, was interrogated at Camp Dustin in June 1945. His statements, preserved in the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, Report 254A, mention Project Regenlicht, prototype array operational late 44, abandoned due to retreat. Falken insisted the system was purely defensive, designed to confuse Allied aircraft. But he also hinted at human testing, admitting that the prototypes were field tested on Russian prisoners of war to determine sensory endurance. When pressed for details, he simply said, "They could not close their eyes fast enough." Prosecutors at Nuremberg considered these testimonies sufficient for inclusion in the tribunal's technical evidence archive. The result was Annex 13D, an evidentiary file meant to document a category of war crimes involving experimental weaponry. Yet 13D was never opened in court. The official tribunal transcript contains no reference to it. A 1947 memo from US Army legal counsel Colonel Telford Taylor explains that materials of a sensitive technical nature pertaining to psychological experimentation have been deferred to military custody pending further review. In bureaucratic terms, that was a polite way of saying buried. What happened to the crate next remains uncertain. One theory suggests it was transferred to the newly formed US Army Air Technical Intelligence Command, ATIC-E, in Dayton, Ohio, under the guise of paperclip evaluation. Another posits it was rerouted to the British Porton Down Chemical and Biological Centre, where recovered enemy research was often tested. Supporting this, a declassified British correspondence from 1949 lists One container marked 13D, origin Nuremberg, contents. Sealed, optical neurological field. The entry was crossed out in red ink, followed by a handwritten note. Return to US custody per Joint Directive 421B. That directive, now mostly redacted, was signed by representatives from both MI6 and the newly created CIA. The few who later glimpsed fragments of the file describe chilling details. A German-language inventory list titled Anlage I17T included 6 items, 2 broken quartz lenses, 1 field manual titled Versuchsbericht Nummer 9, Regenlichtsystem. Several rolls of photographic film and 3 handwritten notebooks recovered from Smolensk. The last item, human observation logs, was listed as classified beyond tribunal level. None of these materials survive in public archives. Rumors persisted that 13D contained evidence of a working battlefield prototype, possibly deployed during the final retreat through Belarus. Soviet accounts mention entire platoons found dead without gunfire wounds, their pupils dilated, their retinas exhibiting microburns. Western historians often dismiss these as propaganda, yet a confidential Soviet forensic bulletin from 1946, discovered in Moscow's WWII archive, matches those symptoms exactly: retinal desynchronization and neuromuscular collapse caused by photonic overexposure. The bulletin's conclusion: artificial light source, origin unknown. In 1952, under the CIA's high Project Artichoke, US intelligence began exploring light and sound as potential methods of psychological control. Internal documents reference foreign optical studies as the foundation for these experiments. A line in one Artichoke memo reads, "Data derived from Nuremberg Annex file, originally classified 13D." Though the agency later denied any connection to Nazi research, the correlation is difficult to ignore. By the mid-1950s, the program evolved into MK Ultra, under which stroboscopic and sensory experiments were again tested. This time under laboratory conditions, often without consent. Meanwhile, the original crate seemed to vanish entirely. It resurfaced only once, briefly in 1977, when a Defense Logistics Agency warehouse audit in Nevada listed a container labeled Property of Department of the Army, 13D Box 001. The box's contents were noted as Scientific Instruments, Origin, Undetermined. 3 months later, it was struck from the ledger. The warehouse manager, interviewed years later, recalled that a team of non-uniformed personnel arrived one night with transfer orders stamped NSA Clearance Level Sigma. They loaded the crate onto an unmarked truck and left before dawn. Independent researchers have long tried to reconstruct the truth behind 13D. In 2002, historian Dr. Helene Varga uncovered a microfilm reel at the US National Archives labeled Nuremberg Technical Annexes. Frame 2239 shows a blurred photograph of an apparatus, a tripod-mounted lens assembly surrounded by cables and capacitors, with the caption Regenlichtsystem, Smolensk, October 1944. The accompanying note reads, "Recovered by CIOS Team 7, evaluation incomplete." Varga's publication on the subject was swiftly challenged by both German and American agencies, who claimed misidentification. Nevertheless, the image matched contemporary descriptions of a light suppression weapon. By 2010, the subject had drifted into obscurity again, confined to declassified document hunters and Cold War researchers. Yet one small clue re-emerged in 2015, when the German Federal Archives digitized post-war Siemens correspondence. Among thousands of mundane letters, one internal memo from 1947 stands out. Written to Siemens board from their Munich branch, it reads, US representatives requested remaining optical field records. Compliance achieved. Documents handed to Lieutenant Colonel Hauser, War Crimes Division. The signature matched the same officer who logged the crate at Nuremberg. The coincidence is impossible to ignore. Hauser receives the documents in 1947. 13D disappears, and within years, US agencies begin studying neurological responses to light. If Regenlicht truly existed, it may have been the first battlefield attempt at optical neuroweaponry, technology decades ahead of its time, buried beneath the euphemism of psychological research. In the end, only echoes remain: a missing box, redacted pages, and faint references in Cold War research budgets. Officially, Prosecutors Annex 13D never existed. Unofficially, it shaped half a century of experimentation the public was never meant to see. Somewhere in a forgotten storage vault or deep defense archive, that crate may still rest. Its glass lenses wrapped in military paper, the final evidence of a weapon built not to destroy bodies, but to extinguish the mind. Chapter 4. The Moscow Signal. Files from the Embassy Vault. At 2:17 p.m. on April 4, 1953, a technician inside the United States Embassy in Moscow adjusted the gain on a newly installed radio receiver. The signal coming through was not from any Soviet broadcast, but from the air itself, a steady, pulsing wave, faint yet persistent, emanating directly toward the embassy's upper floors. Within weeks, several embassy staff reported headaches, fatigue, and unexplained rashes. The State Department quietly replaced medical officers, increased food inspections, and blamed environmental factors. What they did not disclose was that US intelligence had already identified the anomaly. A continuous microwave beam directed at the building from an adjacent apartment block on Tchaikovsky Street. The discovery was classified under C Project Pandora. The phenomenon would later become known as the Moscow Signal. For more than 2 decades, from 1953 until 1976, the American embassy was bathed in invisible radiation. The source was no larger than a shoebox. An emitter fixed behind a false wall of the neighboring building, codenamed Source 7. By the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, intercept logs reveal that the frequency fluctuated between 2.5 and 4.4 GHz, modulated at low amplitudes. The Soviets claimed ignorance, yet the beam's precision, directed at the ambassador's office and communications center, proved otherwise. Internal memos dated September 1953 describe a joint operation between the CIA and the US Navy's Bureau of Ships Electronics Division, tasked with installing hidden detectors in embassy rooms. They found that the signal intensified when staff approached windows, implying a secondary function, eavesdropping on typewriters and telephones via subtle electromagnetic induction. However, subsequent readings revealed fluctuations unrelated to communication frequencies, suggesting additional unknown parameters. By 1955, medical reports from embassy staff told a darker story. Personnel experienced chronic insomnia, skin lesions, and abnormal blood counts. One administrative clerk, Sarah Flanagan, developed leukemia at age 29. Her death certificate listed unknown etiology. A classified State Department cable, declassified only in 2003, contains a note in the margin. Possible RF exposure correlation. Keep contained. When Washington finally informed Ambassador Charles Bolan of the radiation, he was instructed not to alert his staff. The fear was panic, not protection. In 1959, the CIA formalized the study under the code name Operation Pandora, supervised by Dr. Milton Zarett of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. His preliminary conclusion was disturbing. Prolonged exposure to low-intensity microwave radiation produced measurable neurological effects, including fatigue, irritability, and reduced cognitive performance. The Pentagon redirected $1.5 million to study microwave bioeffects, disguised under a public health research grant. Meanwhile, the beam continued. Records show that the Soviet emitter's modulation pattern was complex, carrying frequencies corresponding to known human biological resonances. In other words, it seemed tuned to the human nervous system. Whether by design or accident, no one could agree. The National Security Agency began compiling data under its E-Wave project, correlating embassy staff illness reports with intensity readings. In one debriefing note dated April 18, 1960, a CIA technical officer wrote, "If signal is behavioral in nature, source objective unclear. No observable command coding detected, possibly experimental." Throughout the 1960s, the beam persisted, sometimes weakening, sometimes returning stronger than before. Engineers discovered that each time embassy technicians installed countermeasures, the signal subtly changed frequency. It adapted. One anonymous field report concluded, "The source seems to respond to our interference as if monitored." Attempts to trace control transmissions failed. The building opposite remained under KGB authority, its top floors sealed to outsiders. Soviet workmen were occasionally seen entering through a rear courtyard, carrying crates labeled television maintenance equipment. By 1964, the issue reached President Lyndon B. Johnson's National Security Staff. A meeting transcript between CIA Director John McCone and Secretary of State Dean Rusk includes this exchange. Rusk: "Do we inform the Soviets we are aware?" Chuck McCone: "No, we're still learning more from their silence than their words." Rusk: "And the health of our people?" McCone: "Expendable for now. Controlled environment." The phrase controlled environment later appeared in Pandora's technical annex, suggesting that US scientists viewed the embassy as a living laboratory. Blood samples, brainwave readings, and behavioral assessments were covertly taken from embassy personnel during periodic health checks. Some staff reportedly signed blank consent forms believing they were for medical insurance renewals. In one case, a CIA doctor noted EEG deviations consistent with RF entrainment. Then, in 1972, an event shifted the narrative. A Soviet scientist, Dr. Yuri Temikhanov, defected briefly during a diplomatic tour in Vienna, carrying documents he claimed explained the true purpose of the signal. The papers never surfaced publicly, but a summary in a classified cable, State Department Archive Box 11172, described a Soviet research initiative titled Program Znamya, involving the study of psychophysical modulation of foreign personnel through directed energy. Temikhanov disappeared 2 weeks later. Austrian police records state he returned voluntarily to the USSR. No further trace was found. After nearly 23 years of exposure, the US Embassy underwent renovation in 1976. The signal ceased the day before new detection arrays were installed. No one claimed responsibility, and the Soviets maintained denial until the end of the Cold War. The US government, under media pressure, downplayed the story. Official statements referred to harmless low-level microwaves used for electronic surveillance. Unofficially, Operation Pandora's findings were sealed under AINT Section 42BE, an intelligence classification reserved for human effects research with national security implications. Declassified fragments of Section 42B files reveal chilling conclusions. A document titled Summary of Behavioral Findings, Embassy Moscow Personnel, 1953-1976, outlines statistically significant increases in neurological disorders among long-term staff. Several paragraphs remain redacted, but the surviving lines include one cryptic statement: no conclusive evidence of external coercion. However, consistent behavioral anomalies suggest indirect modulation. In 1981, congressional hearings briefly touched on the incident. Witnesses from the State Department were evasive. When asked if the signal might have been a psychological experiment, one official answered, "That question has been asked internally for 20 years. Another added, "The origin was undetermined, but the phenomenon was real." No criminal investigation followed. The case remained dormant until 1998, when Freedom of Information Act requests revealed additional cables. Referencing Source 7, the most startling discovery came from a 1963 memorandum written by CIA Technical Officer Lawrence B. Hines. Subject beam pattern correlates to early radar biomodulation research conducted by US Navy, 1948-51, Soviets possibly exploiting data from captured German experiments. The memo linked back to obscure wartime files recovered from Berlin concerning electromagnetic behavioral disruption. It implied that what began as Nazi research may have found new life in Cold War Moscow. Today, the original equipment used to measure the signal sits in a classified storage facility in Maryland. Technicians who handled it later reported persistent tinnitus and migraines. One retired engineer, interviewed anonymously in 2010, claimed that the emitter's modulation contained structured pulses, almost like Morse code, but biological, beats per minute rather than dots and dashes. When he attempted to analyze them, his superiors confiscated the tapes. The Moscow signal remains one of the most enduring Cold War mysteries. Neither Washington nor Moscow ever admitted its true purpose. Some believe it was a crude eavesdropping device. Others, a psychological experiment designed to test electromagnetic influence on human cognition. What cannot be denied is the silence surrounding the matter. Hundreds of pages remain classified to this day. The final line of the last surviving log entry from the embassy's security archive reads, "Signal harmonized. Embassy secure. Source undetermined." Whatever pulsed through the air of Moscow for 23 years left more than radiation behind. It left a question. When the enemy listens, and both sides experiment, who truly controls the signal? Chapter 5. The Arctic Black Box. On February 12, 1952, a Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft designated Flight 617D, operating out of RAF Loichars in Scotland, departed for what was publicly listed as a meteorological survey mission. The aircraft, a modified Avro Lincoln bomber, never returned. Hours after takeoff, its signal vanished over the Norwegian Sea, somewhere north of Svalbard. Official reports blamed severe weather. The mission log, however, told another story. Its flight path aligned not with atmospheric routes, but with the Soviet Arctic testing corridor near Novaya Zemlya, where Britain's Joint Intelligence Bureau believed the USSR was experimenting with unconventional weapons. The file on 617D remained classified for more than half a century. Recovered RAF operational orders show the flight's codename as Operation Cold Harbor. Its true objective: track anomalous electromagnetic signatures detected by British radar along the Arctic Circle, allegedly emanating from Soviet test sites. Accompanying the flight was a US Air Force technical observer, Captain Gerald H. Lawson. Attached to the Strategic Air Command's Research Division, his presence was quietly omitted from the final casualty list. In an internal RAF memo dated March 3, 1952, the Chief of Air Staff noted, "American Liaison Officer, classified attachment, do not publish name." At 17:08 hours, the aircraft's last transmission came through to RAF Fylingdales. Contact echo located, intensity rising, readings unstable, then silence. Search and rescue operations continued for 6 days. Icebreakers found only scattered debris, an oxygen mask, a torn flight suit, and fragments of an aluminum casing marked "Property of the US Strategic Air Command." The plane's black box was missing. Norwegian fishermen later reported metallic wreckage drifting near Bjørnøya, Bear Island, but when naval divers reached the site, they encountered nothing but sediment and jagged ice. The incident was quietly closed as lost at sea. Years later, in 1954, fragments of radio transcripts surfaced in declassified Norwegian Navy logs. One entry recorded an intercepted emergency signal from an unidentified aircraft, a faint Morse transmission repeating, "Echo, mirror, flare." Intelligence officers speculated it referred to the mission's target, possibly a Soviet radar array codenamed Zerkalo, mirror. But an internal Air Ministry analysis painted a stranger picture. According to Intelligence Summary 554, Arctic Sector, pre-mission briefings had included reference to a magnetic anomaly exceeding 3,000 Gauss. No known Soviet test produced such readings. In 1956, a British geophysicist attached to the NATO Project IceCap expedition reported that his magnetometer instruments malfunctioned near the same coordinates. The team recorded distortions consistent with localized ferromagnetic inversion, an impossible event under natural conditions. 2 weeks after returning to port, the IceCap report was classified under US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement File 742, sealing all data related to Arctic magnetic research. The lead scientist, Dr. Edmund Varley, died of a sudden cerebral hemorrhage before he could present his findings. His widow later claimed his notebooks were confiscated by 2 men from the embassy. By 1960, the United States Navy's Office of Naval Research had launched Project IceCap 2, this time using submarines to explore the same region. One of those submarines, the USS Seawolf, reported detecting a massive metallic structure embedded beneath the polar ice. Crew journals describe sonar echoes, returning circular geometries inconsistent with rock or ice. The mission log abruptly ends on May 2, 1960, followed by a single typed page reading only, "Primary object surveyed. No retrieval attempted. Seawolf proceeding south." All subsequent pages were removed. In 1978, the world briefly caught a glimpse of the forbidden story. A retired RAF archivist mistakenly included a classified photograph in a public release. a black and white image showing a spherical metallic object half submerged in ice, its surface scorched and ridged like a turbine casing. The accompanying note read, "Recovered debris, 1952 Operation Cold Harbor." The photo was withdrawn within 48 hours, but copies circulated among defense historians. Forensic analysis confirmed its authenticity. The background matched the Svalbard coastline. What was the sphere? Officially, no answer was ever given. Theories ranged from a Soviet reactor core to remnants of a crashed aircraft, even to secret Anglo-American technology lost during reconnaissance. Yet scattered testimony hints at something deeper. In 1991, a retired Norwegian naval officer, Commander Erik Nielsen, disclosed in an interview that his father had participated in a covert recovery operation that same year as the 6117D crash. He described divers retrieving a compact object the size of a small car, smooth and metallic, humming even underwater. When they brought it aboard the recovery vessel, instruments went haywire, compasses spun, and radio static filled the air. Within hours, Soviet aircraft approached, circling overhead until the ship was forced to withdraw. Nielsen claimed the object was later transferred to an American transport plane at Tromsø and flown out under diplomatic clearance. The Americans denied all involvement, but internal NATO records from 1953, discovered in Brussels archives, list a top-secret transfer labeled Project Magnetron, Svalbard Acquisition. The delivery manifest includes one sealed containment unit, high ferromagnetic density, source unspecified, destination, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio, the same facility known for storing recovered foreign technology during the Cold War. The file was signed by Major J.W. McCarthy, whose name appears elsewhere connected to the debriefing of German scientists under Operation Paperclip. In 1989, following the thaw of the Cold War, Russian scientists granted limited access to their Arctic archives. Among the documents released was a 1952 KGB intelligence brief titled Operacja Echo, Operation Echo. The report described a British reconnaissance intrusion over classified naval testing sector, foreign aircraft destroyed by magnetic interference from experimental generator. The generator in question was part of Project Oriole, a Soviet program researching electromagnetic propulsion. Its chief engineer, Viktor Tretyakov, testified years later that the device malfunctioned, producing an energy pulse that collapsed nearby instrumentation. When asked if the pulse could have caused an aircraft to crash, Tretyakov answered simply, "It was not meant for flight, only for power." Still, even Tretyakov's statement failed to explain why the Soviets recovered no wreckage, nor why their own ships avoided the coordinates afterward. In a 1968 naval directive, Soviet captains were explicitly forbidden from approaching an area north of Svalbard, labeled Sector 9E, the exact location of Flight 617D's disappearance. The directive remains classified even after the fall of the USSR. By the 2000s, digital mapping of the Arctic seabed revealed a peculiar formation beneath the ice, a near-perfect hemispheric depression approximately 60 meters wide, matching sonar profiles described in earlier NATO and Soviet reports. Environmental analysis indicated residual heat flux beneath the site, though no volcanic activity exists in that region. One survey engineer privately called it the wound that never froze. Modern researchers have tried to reopen the Cold Harbor case, but the documentation trail is deliberately fragmented. RAF archives list half the mission logs as destroyed by fire, though no record of that fire exists. The US Air Force's Historical Division denies any knowledge of Captain Lawson, though a payroll ledger from 1951 clearly lists him under Special Detachment. Arctic Reconnaissance, even the black box of Flight 617D, which should have been recovered if the wreck had been found, is officially unaccounted for. Yet an anonymous British defense source admitted in a 1999 interview that a recording device from that mission was stored at a classified MOD facility until at least 1974. It was later transferred to Allied custody. If that device still exists, it may contain the only surviving evidence of what truly happened above the Arctic. Rumors persist that the final audio captured faint mechanical tones, rhythmic and metallic, before the signal cut out. Analysts describe them as structured but non-synthetic, suggesting something external interacting with the aircraft's systems. To this day, The coordinates of Sector 9E remain restricted on both NATO and Russian navigation charts. Commercial satellites routinely show data gaps, frozen pixels, exactly over the suspected crash site. Some call it coincidence, others policy. Officially, the Arctic is silent, but in the cold void between truth and denial, Flight 617D drifts like a phantom on the ice, carrying a black box that no one will admit to owning. Whatever Echo was, it left a scar both nations chose to conceal. And somewhere beneath the permafrost, beneath layers of secrecy and snow, something metallic still hums quietly, just as it did in 1952. Decades later, fragments of these hidden operations remain buried beneath the official record, locked in vaults, redacted in cables, or whispered through the static of forgotten transmissions. The truth doesn't vanish, it adapts, reshaping itself to fit the silence. From the Baltic's sunken convoys to the Arctic's magnetic scars, from airfields erased by post-war reconstruction to embassies bathed in invisible radiation, each file tells the same story. History was edited in real time, and somewhere, in a sealed archive marked for eyes only, the missing pages wait, not to be believed, but to be found.